October 1994. On a recorded line inside a banker's trust trading room, a managing director described the position held by one of the firm's clients. The client was Gibson Greetings, a maker of greeting cards based in Cincinnati. Gibson, he said, had no understanding of what its derivative position was actually worth. The bank could call it anything we want. A second recording, drawn from the same internal taping system, captured a salesman describing the method for disclosing accumulating losses to the client, a little bit at a time, enough to keep the client uneasy, but not enough to make it exit the trade. How could a derivative be priced at all when only one party to the contract controlled the price? That is the question this episode answers. And the answer reveals what the over-the-counter market actually was in 1994. This is the mechanism at the center of the banker's trust case. It has a precise name. It is the markup convention in an unobservable market. Start with what an over-the-counter derivative is and how it differs from anything that trades on an exchange. A derivative is a contract whose value is derived from the movement of some underlying reference. For Gibson Greetings, the references were interest rates. The instruments were interest rate swaps and a series of more exotic structures built on top of them. A plain interest rate swap is simple in concept. Two parties agree to exchange streams of payments. One pays a fixed rate. The other pays a floating rate that resets periodically against a benchmark such as LIBOR. Pay floating, and if rates rise, your payments rise and the position moves against you. If rates fall, the position moves in your favor. No principal changes hands. Only the net difference in the payment streams is settled. Now consider how such a contract is valued at any moment between its start and its maturity. On an exchange, a futures contract has a settlement price published at the close of every trading day. That price is observable. Anyone holding the contract can look it up. The exchange marks every position to that published price and moves margin between accounts accordingly. There is a public reference. And there is a clearinghouse standing between the parties. An over-the-counter swap has none of this. It does not trade on an exchange. There is no published settlement price. Its value at any moment is a model output. To compute it, you take the contractual payment streams, project the floating payments forward using the current yield curve, discount everything back to the present, and arrive at a present value. That number is the mark. It is what the position is worth if it were unwound today. Here is the fact the entire case turns on. The model that produces the mark requires inputs: the current yield curve, the volatility assumptions, the discount factors. In 1994, for a corporate client like Gibson Greetings, those inputs and that model lived inside Banker's Trust. The client had no independent means of generating the number. It did not have a derivatives pricing desk. It did not subscribe to a pricing service that could value these particular structures. When Gibson wanted to know what its position was worth, it called Banker's Trust and asked. The bank told it a number. The client wrote that number into its financial statements. This is what the managing director meant on the tape. The bank could call it anything it wanted. He was not speaking loosely. He was describing the structural reality of the arrangement. The counterparty that stood to gain from the position was also the sole source of the price of the position. The valuation function and the trading interest sat in the same institution, on the same desk, in some instances under the same individuals. Now, the markup. When a dealer sells a derivative to a client, the dealer embeds a margin. This is legitimate and universal. The dealer takes risk, provides liquidity, and earns a spread for doing so. The price the client pays is not the dealer's cost. It includes a markup. On an exchange-traded instrument, the markup is constrained because the client can observe the market price and compare. On a bespoke over-the-counter structure, there is nothing to compare against. The client cannot see the dealer's cost. The client cannot see the size of the markup. The markup is whatever the dealer can build into a structure complex enough that the client cannot reverse engineer it. This is the legitimate baseline the case distorts. A markup compensates a dealer for risk and service. The price disclosed to a client should be the dealer's honest assessment of value. The valuation given to a client for accounting purposes should reflect what the position is actually worth. The SEC enforcement record establishes something else. Bankers' Trust used its control of the price to do what the legitimate convention does not permit. It used the markup not as a one-time spread at the inception of a trade, but as a continuous lever applied to the marks it reported to the client over the life of the position to manage the client's perception of its own losses and to keep the client trading. Understand the structure precisely. There are 3 distinct numbers in any open derivative position. There is the true value, computed honestly from the market. There is the value the dealer reports to the client. And there is the markup, the difference between them. In a clean relationship, the second number equals the first and the markup applies only at inception. In the Gibson relationship, the reported number was managed independently of the true number. The markup became an ongoing instrument of control. Build the architecture. The specifics matter, and the listener should be able to draw this from memory. Gibson Greetings began its relationship with Bankers Trust with a simple objective. The company had issued fixed-rate debt and wanted to reduce its interest expense by swapping into a floating exposure, betting that rates would fall or stay low. The first transactions were ordinary interest rate swaps. According to the SEC's findings, the early trades produced gains for Gibson. This is the first structural step, and it is critical. The relationship was seeded with a winning position. The client trusted the counterparty because the counterparty had made it money. Step 2. As the relationship progressed, the trades grew more complex. The plain swaps gave way to structures with names that signal their exotic character. The ratio swap, the periodic floor, the spread lock, the wedding band, the treasury linked swap, the knockout call option. Each embedded leverage. Each made the position's value more sensitive to rate movements and harder to value independently. The record establishes that as the structures grew more complex, Gibson's ability to understand its own exposure shrank. The valuations grew more dependent on Bankers Trust's models. The models grew more opaque. Step 3. In early 1994, the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates. Gibson's positions were structured so that rising rates moved them against the company. The leverage embedded in the exotic structures amplified the losses. A modest move in rates produced a large move in the position's value. That is the function of the embedded leverage. A ratio swap, for example, can be structured so that the floating payment is multiplied by a factor or squared, so that a small adverse move produces a disproportionate loss. The record establishes that Gibson's losses grew rapidly as rates rose through 1994. Step 4. This is where the markup convention becomes the instrument of the fraud. As the losses mounted, Gibson asked Bankers Trust for valuations. Bankers Trust controlled the number. The SEC's findings established that the bank did not report the true magnitude of the losses. It reported figures that understated them. The internal recordings capture employees discussing precisely this. The position was disclosed to the client a little at a time. The reported losses were managed, large enough to keep the client anxious and engaged, never so large that the client would do the rational thing and close out. Why keep a losing client in a trade rather than let it exit? The structural logic must be stated clearly. Every time Gibson restructured a position rather than closing it, Bankers Trust earned a new markup. The restructuring was presented to the client as a way to manage or reduce its exposure. In substance, each restructuring rolled the existing loss forward into a new and more complex structure, embedded a fresh markup, and deepened the client's dependence on the bank's valuations. The client believed it was working its way out of a hole. The structure of each new trade ensured the hole grew, and that a portion of every restructuring flowed to the bank as undisclosed margin. Consider the mechanics of a single restructuring. Gibson holds a position showing a loss. Bankers Trust proposes a new trade that, on its face, gives Gibson a chance to recover. The new trade incorporates the existing loss into its terms. It is structured with additional leverage. If rates move favorably, Gibson recovers. If they move adversely, Gibson loses far more. The bank prices the new trade. The price includes a markup the client cannot see. The client, working from valuations supplied by the bank, cannot determine that it has just entered a trade in which the odds and the embedded costs are stacked against it. It signs because it wants to recover what it has lost. The SEC's findings establish the scale of the divergence between what Gibson was told and what was true. At points during 1994, the true value of Gibson's positions reflected losses substantially larger than the figures Bankers Trust reported to the company. The reported numbers were not honest estimates that happened to differ. They were deliberately understated to serve the bank's interest in keeping the relationship alive and the markups flowing. Now layer in the recordings. They are the evidentiary spine of this case, and they establish intent in a way financial records alone cannot. Bankers Trust recorded its own lines, as trading firms do for compliance and dispute resolution. Those tapes captured employees describing the strategy in their own words. The managing director's observation that the bank could call the position's value anything it wanted was not an aside. It was a description of operating reality. The salesman's account of disclosing losses gradually to keep the client in the trade was not a hypothetical. It was a description of method. When the SEC and Gibson's litigation obtained those tapes, the gap between the bank's public representations of partnership and its internal description of the relationship went directly on the record. There is a further structural element worth isolating: the asymmetry of expertise. Bankers Trust positioned itself to Gibson as an advisor, a partner in managing the company's interest rate exposure. Gibson treated the relationship accordingly, but the advisor and the counterparty were the same entity, and their interests were opposed. When Bankers Trust recommended a restructuring, it was at once the party proposing the trade, the party on the other side of the trade, the party pricing the trade, and the party valuing the result. Every function that, in a working market, would be distributed across independent actors was concentrated in one institution that profited from the client's confusion. The architecture of the fraud was the architecture of the relationship itself. This brings us to detection. Why did the arrangement persist as long as it did? The answer is not that gatekeepers were negligent in a simple sense. The verification chain for over-the-counter derivatives in 1994 had a missing link. That link was independent valuation. Consider the auditors. Gibson Greetings was a public company. Its financial statements were audited. Derivative positions had to be reflected at some value. But where did the auditors get the value? They got it, in substance, from the same source Gibson did. The position was valued using information that traced back to bankers' trust. An auditor confronting a complex interest rate swap in 1994 had limited independent means of testing the mark. The auditor could confirm the existence of the contract. The auditor could review the terms. But to independently revalue a wedding band or a ratio swap, the auditor would need its own pricing model and its own market inputs. Audit firms of the period generally did not maintain those capabilities for bespoke derivatives. The valuation was, in practice, taken from the counterparty that had every incentive to manage it. The verification chain looped back to the party being verified. Consider the accounting standards. In 1994, the accounting treatment of derivatives was incomplete and inconsistent. The comprehensive framework that would later require derivatives to be carried at fair value with changes recognized in earnings did not yet exist in its mature form. Companies had latitude in how they reflected these positions. A position deeply underwater could, depending on how it was characterized, avoid full and immediate recognition. The standards did not force the loss into the open. This is a structural gap, not an individual failure. The accounting framework had not caught up to the instruments, and the instruments had been engineered in part to exploit exactly that lag. Consider the regulators. Over-the-counter derivatives in 1994 occupied a space that was, by design, lightly regulated. They were privately negotiated contracts between sophisticated parties. The prevailing regulatory philosophy held that such parties could protect themselves and did not require the protections extended to retail investors. No requirement that over-the-counter derivatives be cleared. No requirement that they be reported to a central repository. No requirement that valuations be supplied by an independent source. The market was opaque by design, and the opacity was defended as a feature that allowed customization. The structural consequence. A dealer could embed undisclosed markups and report managed valuations to a client with no external party positioned to see it. Consider the question of sophistication. It is the load-bearing concept in the detection failure. The defense of the over-the-counter market rested on the premise that the parties were sophisticated. A sophisticated party can value its own positions, understand its own risks, and protect its own interests. Bankers Trust's relationship with Gibson tested that premise and broke it. Gibson was a greeting card company. It was a corporate end user, not a financial institution. It had treasury staff. It did not have a derivatives desk capable of independently valuing a leveraged exotic swap. The premise of mutual sophistication, which justified the absence of protections, did not hold for an end user transacting with a derivatives dealer that had engineered the structures specifically to be difficult to value. The regulatory framework assumed a symmetry of capability that did not exist. What would have had to be true for detection to occur earlier? One condition above all: an independent source of valuation. Give Gibson a mark on its positions from a party with no interest in the outcome, and the divergence between true value and reported value becomes visible. The losses appear in their full magnitude. The gradual disclosure strategy becomes impossible because the client holds a number the bank does not control. The entire mechanism depended on the bank being the sole source of price. Independent valuation breaks the mechanism at its root. Its absence is the single structural reason the fraud could operate. There is a further detection question worth examining: the role of the recordings themselves. The tapes existed throughout. Bankers' Trust recorded its lines as a matter of routine. The evidence of intent was being created contemporaneously inside the institution in real time. But recordings are not a detection mechanism. They sit in an archive until a dispute or an investigation compels their production. They do not surface losses. They do not value positions. They become evidence only after exposure has already begun through some other channel. The existence of the tapes tells us that internal candor about the strategy was routine. It does not tell us that any internal control was positioned to act on that candor. The compliance function that recorded the lines was not the function that would have flagged the managed valuations. The information existed within the institution and was not connected to any process that would stop the conduct. This is the structural shape of the detection failure. It was not that a gatekeeper looked at the fraud and failed to recognize it. No gatekeeper was positioned to look at the one thing that mattered: whether the reported value matched the true value. The auditors took the value from the chain that led back to the bank. The accounting standards did not force the loss into the open. The regulators had exempted the market from the requirements that would have created an independent price. And the premise of sophistication that justified all of this did not describe the actual client. Every link in the chain assumed that some other link was doing the verification. None of them was. Now, the unraveling. The exposure did not come from an auditor catching the discrepancy or a regulator detecting the managed marks in real time. It came from the losses themselves growing too large to manage. And it came from the client, once it understood the magnitude of what had happened, pursuing the matter through litigation and regulatory complaint. By the latter part of 1994, the losses on Gibson's positions had grown to a scale that could no longer be disclosed a little at a time. The Federal Reserve's rate increases through that year had driven the leveraged positions deeply underwater. The record establishes that Gibson ultimately recognized losses on its derivative transactions far in excess of what it had understood its exposure to be. The company disclosed substantial charges related to the positions. The magnitude of the loss, set against the company's earlier understanding, raised the question of how the gap between expectation and reality had grown so wide. Gibson and Bankers' Trust entered into dispute. In the course of that dispute, the internal recordings were produced. The tapes were the turning point. They moved the matter from a disagreement about valuation, in which the bank could plausibly argue that complex positions are inherently difficult to price, to a documented record of employees describing a deliberate strategy of misrepresenting value to a client. A dispute over modeling assumptions is defensible. A recording of a managing director saying the bank could call the value anything it wanted is not. The Securities and Exchange Commission brought an enforcement action. In December 1994, Bankers Trust settled with the SEC and with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. The institution consented to the entry of findings without admitting or denying them, the standard form of such settlements. The enforcement record established the conduct. Bankers Trust had made misrepresentations to Gibson Greetings regarding the value of its derivative positions. The bank had provided valuations that did not reflect the true magnitude of the losses, and this conduct had induced Gibson to enter into additional transactions. The settlement required Bankers Trust to pay penalties and to make Gibson substantially whole on the disputed positions. The bank also entered into a written agreement with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York concerning its leveraged derivatives business, imposing requirements on how the bank dealt with clients in such transactions going forward. Examine what the enforcement action established. The misrepresentation was not about whether a price was right or wrong in a market sense. It was about the relationship between the price the bank knew and the price the bank reported. The CFTC and SEC findings turned on the gap between Bankers Trust's internal valuations and the valuations it conveyed to the client. The bank knew one number and told the client another. That gap, documented on the bank's own tapes, was the violation. The case did not require proving that the derivatives were unsuitable in the abstract or that complexity was itself wrongful. It required showing that the valuations reported to the client diverged knowingly from the valuations the bank itself maintained. The markup convention used to manage a client's perception of its own losses was the conduct the enforcement reached. The collapse of the mechanism, once exposed, was immediate. The reason is structural. The entire scheme depended on the bank being the unchallenged source of price. The moment a second number entered the record, the bank's own internal valuations placed alongside the figures it had given the client, the divergence was self-proving. No defense was available that did not require the two numbers to be the same. They were not. A fraud built on the asymmetry of a single price source cannot survive the production of the second price. The tapes did more than show intent. They confirmed that the bank had maintained a true valuation internally while reporting a managed one externally. The existence of the internal number defeated any claim that the difficulty of valuation excused the discrepancy. There is a wider sequence worth placing on the record. The Gibson matter did not stand alone. The same period saw other Bankers Trust clients raise similar concerns about leveraged derivative structures and the valuations they had been given. The pattern was consistent. Complex structures, embedded leverage, valuations controlled by the dealer, and losses that exceeded the client's understanding of their exposure. The Gibson case became the documented center of this pattern because of the recordings. But the mechanism it exposed was not unique to a single client relationship. It was a feature of how leveraged over-the-counter derivatives were sold to corporate end users in that period. What does the Bankers Trust case establish about the mechanism considered as a forensic matter rather than a moral one? It establishes that a price is not a fact when only one party can compute it. The over-the-counter derivative, as it existed in 1994, placed the valuation function inside the counterparty. That arrangement was tolerated on the premise that the parties were sophisticated and the market was self-policing. The case demonstrated otherwise. When the valuation function and the trading interest sit in the same institution, and the client cannot independently generate the price, the markup convention ceases to be a spread for service. it becomes a lever for control. The dealer can report whatever value serves its interest, and the client has no number to contradict it. This is not a failure of character. It is a property of the structure. Concentrate price setting and trading interest in one party, remove independent valuation, and the outcome follows from the architecture. The regulatory response addressed the structure. In the years following, the accounting framework for derivatives was overhauled. The Financial Accounting Standards Board developed comprehensive requirements that derivatives be carried at fair value, with the determination of fair value subjected to greater rigor and disclosure. The push toward independent and observable valuation inputs gained force directly from cases in which dealer-supplied marks had proven unreliable. In the broader arc of derivatives regulation, the questions bankers' trust raised, who values an over-the-counter position, who can see the price, who stands between the parties, would recur. They would eventually drive the movement towards central clearing, trade reporting, and valuation transparency that reshaped the market in the decades that followed. The finding of this review is narrow and structural. The bankers' trust case did not establish that derivatives are dangerous, or that complexity is fraud, or that one institution behaved worse than its peers. It established that a market in which the seller of a contract is also the sole source of that contract's price contains, within its design, the capacity for the seller to report a value that serves itself. The markup convention was the legitimate tool. The absence of an independent price was the gap. The recordings were the proof. And the mechanism, once the second number was placed on the record, could not survive the comparison.